Welcome back to Visited by Voices Live on Monday, the 26th. We're coming to the end of October, which is both joyous as we approach Halloween and a little bit sad because I actually like the season more than I like the holiday in many ways. I like all the changing leaves, the whole season, the stores being decorated, and all that comes to an end this week. So it's always a little bit bittersweet when we get to the end of the month. But I have a distraction for myself and for all of you today that's very, very much a long requested distraction. I'm joined today by Rick R. Reed, the author of 50 novels, including some seminal horror novels at the beginning of the 90s on the much beloved Dell Abyss line. How are you this afternoon in California?
I'm good. We finally turned a corner with our weather here. We had probably one of the longest, hottest summers on record in a long time. So we had like 100 and some days over 100 degrees and several over 110. So today it is 68 and windy, and it's cold for us.
Well, that has to help for a state that's on fire.
Yeah. Well, rain would be nice. We still have all the sunshine and no rain, but
well, that's the California way, though. The sunshine is, pretty much the national mascot.
yes.
So right off the bat, before we go into the regular scheduled program, you already have some people saying hello to you, and I want to make sure they get hit so they don't get lost in the chat if the chat starts moving quicker than my brain, which is just about every show. So we have Molly Grandma waves at Rick. Finally get to hear your voice.
Hi, Molly. Hope you're well.
And Jacob is saying, just wanted to start off the show by saying thanks to Rick Reed for catching Joe Brown. I'm sure he's heard it before, but whatever. Doesn't make it any less important in my opinion.
That's kind of an interesting comment.
It is.
I don't know what that means, honestly.
I'm not exactly sure either. I was hoping you did. But since it's not going to start a conversation, we'll move on. Jacob's a regular viewer of the show, so it's not a troll behavior. I'm not sure just what he's referring to.
Maybe he will elucidate. Is that the right word? I should know words. I'm a writer. Maybe he will illuminate us. Who is Joe Brown, and how did I catch him? And is catching him like catching a disease?
Or in a catching like a Pokemon sort of way. I don't really know what that means. I'm too old for Pokemon, but
maybe that, which I've done. But I do know a Joe Brown, but I don't think that's who he's referring to.
Okay. So all these shows start out with the same question because I think it's the most important question to. My cat is making a copy. If you hear some sound right now, literally. I start off all these shows in pretty much the same way because I think it's the most important question for a lot of us in our personal development. What originally got you bit by the horror bug? What is that early memory of the genre that started you on this path?
Well, I have been writing and loving horror since I was almost as far back as I can remember. So the first thing that comes to mind is I grew up about 45 minutes west of Pittsburgh. And so all of our television stations were Pittsburgh. And every Saturday night there was Chiller Theater, which my parents would allow me to stay up and watch, even though it was on at 11:30. So I would watch a double feature of horror movies, probably starting like 7, 8 years old. So I think I got fairly inundated with horror as a child and built up kind of a tough skin toward horror. So it takes a lot to disturb me. It takes a lot to scare me. Unlike my husband, who won't watch a lot of this stuff with me, but it doesn't faze me, but it does fascinate me. And so I would say I got bit by the bug as a kid. And my first novel, Obsessed, was evidence of that, I guess. It's about man in Chicago who's a serial killer and who believes he's a vampire. And
So before we get on to Obsessed, because that is the first stop on our tour, let me ask: was Chili Billy the host of the Creature Feature show at that point?
how do you know that? Yes, Chili.
I know my horror hosts.
Yes, he was.
That's incredible. That he had one of the most offbeat shows of its time. A lot of people were trying to do the Universal Monsters basically in the cellar, and he was just going all out insane.
Yes.
Pretty cool. So that's great. I mean, unfortunately, my local show, because being in Jersey, I got New York and Philadelphia, and Philly didn't actually have a horror host until Stella with Saturday Night Dead much later on. But in the earliest days, we had Creature Feature from New York, but it did not have a host. It just had movies, which I'm still very thankful for. But I love horror hosts. Like, I would say they're one of the most important things about my formative years is when I'd see clips from around the country of these people, these insane people that were kind of the Johnny Appleseeds of horror. They were just making sure all of us got bit by the bug.
It definitely made it more fun to have that connection, and they made it more fun. I think at least Chili Billy loved horror, so that was made it just kind of like for a lonely little boy who loved horror. It was kind of like a friend.
Yeah, I mean, that's very similar to my story because, I was very rural. I didn't have a lot of friends, and I could count on, there's very few things I could count on, but the monster movies on Saturday afternoon were the thing I could count on. They were always there for me. So I think it is important. And I wonder if today, without that kind of broadcast television, it's quite the same experience for kids. I hope they have it even better, but I fear that they might be losing something.
I would lean toward they lose something because, when I was a child, and I'm old, but there was no streaming, there was no even recording of anything. So if you watched Chiller Theater, you could talk about it on Sunday, and everyone else watched it at the same time and watched the same thing. We don't have that continuity anymore. So, and that's kind of sad, but we also have a lot more options now of things to see and a lot more choice.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very true that if I were a kid, now rather than the late 70s, early 80s, it would be easy for me to get a hold of all those films that I only had in reference books. Because my parents would buy any book for me. It didn't matter. If I was about reading, they were happy. If they knew it was inside most of those books, but they didn't because they weren't going to read them. But
how old were you? And how old were you when you, what's the first horror novel you remember reading? And was it inappropriate for your age?
Well, I remember the first two books I picked up off of a yard sale blanket on a lawn was The Glow and Stephen King's Night Shift collection.
Oh, yeah. With the hand and cutout?
Yep. There's actually a tribute to that at the beginning of this video.
Oh,
although it's funny because I'm not going to say I'm less of a King fan than I was then, because that's not true. I love classic King a lot, but I'm much more interested in the variety of voices that are floating around the horror sphere at this point. So I've become a lot hugely less focused on King than I was as a younger man.
Yeah, I've been a fan of King all my life, but I think my first horror novel I remember reading, which is probably part of the reason I'm kind of so warped, was in third grade. I was visiting my aunt in Michigan for a couple of weeks, and she had a copy of Rosemary's Baby. And
You're Levine.
That as a third grader. Well,
so the satire didn't hit you then at all?
No. Is there satire?
Sure there is. But I wouldn't have gotten it as in third grade. That's for damn sure.
I read way beyond. I'm not trying to make myself sound smarter than I am, but I read way beyond what I probably should have. My parents didn't censor what I read. They just told me to go outside and play rather than read. But I prefer to stay inside and read and watch horror movies. And then I turned out, I don't know, did I turn out okay?
We're still breathing. Something happened, right?
The jury is still out.
So tell us a little bit about Obsessed, about the writing of the book and how you sold it to Gian and how that all went down.
Okay. I don't know if this is backwards.
No, it should be right.
This is the original Obsessed. It's, here we go. Beyond Good and Evil, Beyond All Control. I probably started writing Obsessed in my early 20s, actually, and would write it off and on at various jobs. I was an advertising copywriter when I was out of college, and I would, once I had it finished, I would send it out to agents and publishers, and there was no like print on demand or digital media or anything like that at the time. So all I could do was keep sending it out, and it got rejected and got rejected. And I believe it got, I think Warner Books had a line of horror paperbacks at the time, and they were interested, but they wanted me to change it a lot. And I didn't want to do that. So I said no. And I kept trying. The book was originally, as I said before, it was about a serial killer and his reign of terror on the city of Chicago who believed he was a vampire. But when I originally wrote the novel, he was a vampire. And my editor at Dell, who eventually published Obsessed, convinced me to change that. And I think it made it much more compelling to have it be more psychological. Getting published at that time was really difficult because if you didn't have an agent, it was hard to get your foot in the door. And you couldn't get an agent unless you had something published. So what I did was I found out, we go back to Stephen King. I found out who Stephen King's agent was, and I began writing. And I bugged them and bugged them and bugged them. But I wrote creative letters. I think I wrote engaging letters. And finally she said, well, there's an up and coming agent in Brooklyn. Her name is Risha Mainhart, and she's taking on some new clients. Why don't you send her the book? And I did. And she took me on, and in a few months she sold Obsessed to this new line of horror called Abyss that was just being developed. I don't think anything had been published in the line yet. But I think Obsessed was maybe the 7th book in the line. It started with Kathy Koja's The Cipher. And it was a very exciting time to see the book get published. And I went to the World Horror Convention with Dell in Nashville the year it came out, and Kathy Koja was there, and Melanie Tam and Brian Hodge and a bunch of other people, and they wanted to make a big splash at the convention. So, and it's gratifying that the book, people are still reading the book, and I haven't read it in many years, but I'm sure it's dated now, but I think it also is probably one of my most passionate stories. I think it's a really kind of roller coaster of a ride of a story.
So Dell Abyss at that time, I mean, most of my audience have been through this story in different ways because I did have both Hodge and Koja on. But it was a really experimental type of process for a basically mass market paperback. I mean, I picked all my copies up at Borders. I mean, these were not difficult to find, and yet they were not cookie cutter, which by the late 80s, kind of the mold that everyone who wanted to be King was coming out on a regular basis. It wasn't hard to find a novel about a kid who escaped a small town after trauma and returned to that town to face the big evil. Okay, that was easy to find if that's what you wanted. And there were some very big names from very successful people doing it. But to find stories that were fresh was a lot harder. And the Dell Abyss line leaned so heavily into that and gave so many unique voices a place to actually breathe. It was an amazing place to be. Did you have regular contact with the other writers on the label, or did you follow up after World Tour?
Well, I saw them. I think Brian Hodge and I forget J.M. Oh, I forget her name now. I'm sorry, but I was living in Tampa, Florida when Obsessed came out, and I know some of the authors came down for a signing, which I did with them. We didn't have social media back in 1991 when the line started, so our contact was limited. But I'm still kind of friendly with some of them. I think there was a glut of horror at the time, as you said, and there were a lot of books that Dell Abyss did something different with the genre, and every book was really special. I remember reading every one of them as they came out. I thought there was something I wanted to mention about that was kind of interesting, but I don't
Well, while you think of that, I don't want to lose Griffin's question. I greatly admire Rick's ability to shift focus on different characters seamlessly. Did Rick have a diagram for each of his characters while he fine-tuned his story?
I am totally kind of by the seat of my pants writer. I do have a general idea of where I want to go. I care passionately about my characters, which it sounds a little insane, but I'm sure other writers say the same thing. I come to care about them, and they kind of guide me. They become sort of independent, and they surprise me with what they do. They surprise me with what they say. And so the word diagram or outline is anathema to me. I don't do that sort of thing. I have tried, but I've found that the end result is not as good as if I just go by my gut, my intuition, my heart, whatever you want to call it. So hopefully that answers the question.
See, I would be terrified to write that way. I would be absolutely paralyzed.
Well, for me, it's kind of fun because it's like reading a book. I get to go on the journey with the characters, and nothing ever turns out the way I expect it. And some of the most gratifying moments in writing for me are when I sit down and I don't even know exactly what's going to happen, but a character will pop up that's fully formed and interesting, and it's like, where did this person come from? It's like the people that appear in dreams that we, as far as we know, we've never seen in real life. And I always wonder, where do those people come from? Because they're fully formed, they have looks, they have characteristics, they have personalities, but it's almost magical.
Isn't it an insane thing when a small detail in your writing that you didn't even know you were going to put there comes out and you realize how well your subconscious is working because it just works?
That could be very true.
It's just amazing. It's you can't even take credit for it because it doesn't feel like part of your active process.
And the best stuff is always effortless. The stuff I have to work really hard to get to, that's usually going to be something that I throw out. But the stuff that I just sit down and it's not difficult at all, it just comes to me, and sort of I'm translating and watching it in my head. That's usually the stuff that really resonates with readers.
Now, a lot of bands will talk about playing the same demo out for 5 years before getting their first record pressed and out to stores, and then they're expected to turn around in a year and produce another record that does just as well, having only workshopped those songs for a very short period of time. A year after Obsessed, here comes Penance.
Yes, but I did think of what I wanted to say about Obsessed, and we'll talk about Penance after that. the it's almost embarrassing to admit, but Obsessed is still, even though I've published lots and lots of books since then, it's still probably my best-selling book. I think when it first came out, it sold 50-some thousand copies, which just is unheard of today. But it was a different time, and so you can't really compare it to a book coming out today because the competition is different, and back then there was no self-publishing. I had Dell behind me, and the book was everywhere. I mean, you could walk into the airport bookstore, you could walk into Kmart, you could find it in the drugstore. So, I mean, it wasn't hard for me to sell that many copies, and I didn't really have much to do with it. I might have written a couple articles for magazines and gone to a couple conventions, but I didn't do the kind of promotion I do these days. And, the payoff was really nice. And one thing that was interesting, and if I can find it, I'll show you. I want to, where is it? I should have had that pulled up. Can you see that?
It's a Russian edition or a Polish edition. I can't make out which.
It's Russian.
It's Russian. Okay.
It's a Russian edition of Obsessed in Penance in one volume.
Oh, it's both.
It's both.
Was that packaged for a sale that way, or did they? How recent is that book?
It was packaged for sale that way. It had illustrations.
Oh, that's so amazing.
It is amazing because when I sold this, my agent said, "Oh, you have an offer from a Russian publisher, and they want to do Obsessed in Penance in one big volume." Okay, great. I signed the contract. I got a little advance, and I went on about my business. I never heard of this book until last year. Almost 30 years later, on Instagram. Some guy that I didn't know had posted that this was one of his favorite books. And I recognized and realized that this was the book I sold back in the early 90s and had never heard of it again, and had assumed, quite rightly, that it had probably never been published because I had looked for it and I could never find it. So I got in touch with him, and he sent me this copy so I could see it. But it took almost 30 years for me to see this. And it's really cool because it's all in the Cyrillic alphabet. And, of course, I can't read any of it, but, the edition is really cool. And anyway, so we can move on if you want, but that.
Well, no, now you stopped me dead with that. So obviously you had no input into the translation. Are you curious to have someone read it that is bilingual to give you a hint about how close they got it?
I have no idea. And even like if it was in Spanish or French or something, I might have, to be able to get the gist of it, but this is a completely different alphabet. So from what I understand from the person, and he was in Ukraine, that it was fairly popular. The thing that kind of makes me wonder is I never saw another penny beyond the advance, so I don't know if I was cheated out a lot of money. But
I would assume that happened, but it's still an amazing thing that I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'm not upset about that, but it's I mean, if a whole lot of people read it and I missed out on some paychecks, that's okay. The main thing for me is that a whole lot of people read it.
Maybe they've opened up a market for you now, though, that you're unaware of.
What's that?
Maybe this has opened up a market for you now that you're unaware of, though.
In Russia?
Yeah. I mean, it's a different world of publishing, but who knows?
Yeah.
So, Penance.
Here's the original.
There we go. And that's the
I have to work with this camera. the thing that's cool about this is there is a quote on the front from Stephen King. And
back when he was still doing that.
well, actually, the story behind this quote, and this is, I would love to say it's just for my book, but it's not. It was for the Abyss line. And the editor of the line, Gene Cavellos, told me that he came to them unsolicited and told them how much he loved the line. And so they asked if they could use some of what he said as blurbs for the covers. So that was really cool.
That is. So how does Penance come out? Was it a multi-book contract, or did you have to go through the submission process all over again? Obviously, knowing the editor and having worked with them, that obviously helps, but...
No, it wasn't a multi-book thing. Actually, going back to that horror convention, it was the World Horror Convention in Nashville that year. And I had breakfast with Gene, my editor, and the person who really founded the line and spearheaded it. And I told her I was writing this book about street kids in Chicago and kind of very blurred the lines between good and evil because it was about a pedophile that preyed on them and kept them prisoner in his basement. It was a very dark book. And I told her that, I didn't think horror just had to be, monsters and things that go bump in the night, that the very real monsters are probably the most horrific. And without realizing I was doing it, I was selling her on the book at that breakfast. So once I finished it, they accepted it pretty quickly. So, and to this day, Penance is probably, I think, my most disturbing book because it deals with street kids. It deals with, they're teenagers, but they're children, and
it deals with predators.
Yeah, and predators and the way they were captured and kept in boxes. And I don't know where all this comes from, but
maybe don't look too deep.
Well, yeah, I don't really question where a lot of stuff comes from. Maybe from all the head injuries I've had over the years.
What are you doing that you're getting so many head injuries?
Well, as a kid, I never broke an arm or broke a leg or anything like that, but I was always like, I got hit by a car when I was 6. I had when I fell over the banister of our family home as a little kid. I was on one of those disc sleds going down the hill and hit the bottom of the hill and a stop sign with the back of my head. Flew over the handlebars of my bike a couple times. So I have stitches all through my head, and I've had concussions. And so getting back to Kathy Koja, I think she wrote a book called Bad Brains.
She did. I have a hardcover copy of it right over there.
So maybe I have bad brains, but they've come in handy for me.
Martin Mund asks, do you think blurbs help sell a book?
Marty, he's one of my favorite people.
But it's not a ranking. It's not a competition, though, guys.
It's not a competition. I love all the people that are commenting, but Marty and I go back to Chicago, where I lived for over 20 years, and we used to be part of this Monday night reading series at the Red Lion, which was a bar across from the Biograph Theater, and which was supposed to be haunted. But every Monday night, a bunch of weird horror and erotica and different writers got together to read their stuff. And Marty was one of them, and he's an amazing writer. But anyway, what I will do, I think blurbs sell a book. Yeah, I think they're really, next to the cover, I think they're the most important thing. I think a buyer of a book probably goes through, at least I do. I do judge a book by its cover. I think you can't. That saying is stupid, at least when it applies to books. But you look at the cover first. If the cover intrigues you, the next thing you probably move on to is the blurb. So, and then you might read a little bit of the book inside. So yeah, I definitely think the blurb is vital. And as I've gone along with smaller presses, I've been writing a lot of my own blurbs for the most part. With the Dell Abyss books, they were written by copywriters that they either contracted with or had on staff. But and I'm happy with those blurbs. But yeah, it's really hard, and I think to crystallize what a book is about in a blurb, and also really hard to, especially as a writer, if you're having a lot of input, you want to tell the whole story, and you can't do that. You just have to tantalize somebody, give them a tiny little taste, and intrigue them. It's like a movie trailer. You don't want it to tell the whole story, and you've seen, I'm sure we've all seen movie trailers like that they end and we're like, well, we already know what the whole movie is about. So the best ones kind of mystify us and draw us in. And I think that's the same with blurbs. And if you have a good one, I think it can help sell a book.
I think that's one of the most interesting things about readers finding new writers that they've never, not necessarily new to writing, but people they've never experienced before, is there isn't the kind of social pool there used to be, whereas word would get around about a book. It's weird. We have more communication tools than ever, but I think art and blurbs make more difference now than ever before, because the chances of you just going to a bookstore and sitting down at a table or, on a bench and reading a couple pages is pretty thin these days. It's just not where our culture is at. So I think all that stuff matters even more.
Well, who goes to a bookstore anymore? I mean, well, especially with what's going on right now, I haven't been in one in probably a couple of years. And I used to love that. That was probably, a bookstore was one of my favorite places to be, next to a library. But now I buy everything online. So it's through social media and whatever lists I'm on that I might get emailed. But yeah, that blurb is all important now, because you read that and then you go buy the book, which that's why I have, and it's so easy now to buy the book. I don't have to go to a bookstore. I can just one click on Amazon and I've got it. And that's why I have hundreds of books on my Kindle that I haven't read yet. But there's always another pretty shiny one coming along that I think, oh, I want that. I'll read that too. So, and I'm always promising myself, I'll read the 6 books that are on my Kindle page, and then I'll move on to the next page. And it never works that way, because Stephen King has a new book out, or Brian Freeman has a new book out, or whoever has a new book out, and I'll have to get that, and I have to read it then. So,
absolutely. So I take it, are you mostly reading electronically these days?
Yeah. Yeah, I read on my phone, I read on my Kindle, I read on my iPad. I very rarely pick up a print book anymore, because, and I get print books as gifts, and I will often buy the ebook, and because my mind doesn't work the same as it used to look at a book and read the printed page. I'm so accustomed now to having it electronically and knowing exactly where I left off, and I can make the type size different. And so, yeah. And it's the same with writing. I mean, I can remember in college writing, in high school, writing short stories out longhand. And that's how I had to do it.
Oh, I can't imagine. That terrifies me.
And then, I probably wrote most of Obsessed on a typewriter, an IBM Selectric, and it wasn't, and probably the same was true of Penance. But then, then I finally, in late 90s, probably got my first computer, or earlier 90s. I think Penance was probably written on a computer, but it probably wasn't written in Microsoft Word, and it was probably printed out with my dot matrix printer where I had to separate all the pages.
I remember when I got my first word processor, it was a Panasonic with a built-in screen, but it only allowed you, like, I think it was 16 lines.
Oh, I remember those. I covered those. I wanted one.
Yeah, you would. I mean, they were great because you could save things and change them without using all that paper. But they were also really frustrating because if you didn't take notes as you went along as well as you should, you had to continually page up, like you wouldn't believe, then page back down. So it was good and bad. The revolutions of electronics. A couple questions from the chat. One of which is pretty specific to you, I think, and the other one is pretty general, but I think they're both worth asking. Lost Cunningham, Tim asks, I enjoyed Sluggo Snares a Vampire. Going to read Dead End Street next. I grew up on the Ohio River, so I think I'll enjoy that one also.
Well, I also grew up on the Ohio River. I actually lived a couple blocks from there, in the foothills of the Appalachians. Small town, right where Ohio, Pennsylvania, and the northern panhandle of West Virginia come together on the Ohio River. So some of my books, a lot of my books are set in Chicago, where I lived most of my adult life, but there are a few that I've set in that sort of universe of the foothills of the Appalachians on the Ohio River. I never call it my hometown, which is East Liverpool, Ohio. I call it Summitville. And Dead End Street is my only young adult novel, but it's about a kid a bunch of kind of misfit kids who form this Halloween horror club, and they meet in this abandoned house, and each of them tells a story. It's sort of a Canterbury Tales of horror, but the overriding story is there was a murder in the house many years ago, and the overriding story is someone is watching them, someone is hiding in the house, and so that's all I'll say about that. I did want to mention that I have a book called Third Eye, which is about a psychic, a reluctant psychic. And there have been some murders of young girls in the small town where this reluctant psychic lives, and he has visions into how they're killed, and they come to him. The dead girls come to him, and I think my setting of my hometown, which is a very big part of it, and what did I want to say about that? I had a point, but it'll come to me.
Well, let's jump to Jess's question, and then we'll come back. This is a much less specific one, but what is Rick's favorite slasher/horror series icon?
Oh.
Changing gears entirely.
That's broad. Well, I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is the original Halloween. So I guess that's what I would say. I kind of trust what comes to mind first. And I remember seeing that when it first came out. And I was, I think, a sophomore in college. So that will date me. And I'd never seen anything like it. And as I said at the beginning of our talk, I said I'm pretty jaded when it comes to horror. Not much scares me, but I remember being terrified by that movie during it and walking home in the dark after it. It was really had an impact, and I think it had an impact on the whole genre and filmmaking and everything, because it really started all the slasher movies. Everything, all the good or bad slasher movies kind of came after that. And so that's the first thing that comes to my mind.
And no one can fault you for choosing the first Halloween. Now, if you chose one of the later sequels, I don't know what I'd say, but
wasn't there one called Season of the Witch?
The third film, but that was actually written by Nigel Neal from the Quatermass series in Britain, before De Laurentiis completely screwed it up. But It's still, I think it's a fun movie, but I always wanted that original version because he was a hell of a writer.
Oh, I know what I wanted to say about Third Eye. The book I was talking about The Reluctant Psychic. The killers in that book, one of my other fascinations is true crime. And if it means anything to anybody, the killers in that book are a couple who call themselves Myra and Ian. And they are based on the Moors murderers, which was a murderous couple in the UK in the 1960s who murdered several young people and recorded their deaths as they killed them. And so I based the characters on that couple, and it I think made it a little more chilling, and I updated it to having them record their killings on video. The original killers did it just audio tape, but they could open it up with video.
That is sort of a reoccurring theme in your fiction of the serial killer or the urban predator.
Mm-hmm.
That it definitely, for your horror work, is almost a leitmotif which we always return to in some form. Is it just that love of true crime, or is it just how your brain works? What do you think that is?
I think that the scariest movies I've seen, the scariest books I've read, vampires, werewolves, ghosts, they're all fun and I write about them too. But the scariest monsters are the ones that are real and that can really happen. So that's why I have a fascination with serial killers. That's why I have such an interest in crime and the criminal mind, because going back to Stephen King again, what's his quote? I've used it before. There are monsters inside us, and what is it? It's a great quote. Let's see if I have it. Monsters are real and ghosts are real too. They live inside us and sometimes they win. And I think those are the most terrifying monsters, because they can actually appear, whereas fantastic monsters aren't as likely to really appear in real life, although I'm open to anything. But yeah, that's what I find the most terrifying are the real life monsters.
Looking a bit forward in your career, where it's coming to the mid 2000s. In 2006, you have a short story collection titled "Twisted: Tales of Obsession and Terror." This collection comes at a weird time in the publishing world, because we're starting to see the change happen. Short stories are finding less of homes in magazines and anthologies, as there's just less of those things. Can you tell us a little bit about navigating that world, and at what point, how do you feel about short stories and your short work versus your novels?
Well, it's a completely different process, and I don't. Again, as I said, I'm more intuitive, but I think I have to think differently when I'm writing a novel as opposed to a short story. A short story is usually about some crucial moment in time, whereas a novel would be more about progression of events. And usually when I write a short story, I have a better idea of where it's exactly going to go. Whereas writing a novel, I think, as I describe my process, it's intuitive and goes along with, I think it was E.L. Doctorow who said something like, you can write a book. Writing a book is like driving at night, and you can only see as far as the headlights will show you, but you can get to where you're going, but you can only see what's in the light, the illumination of the headlights. But I mean, I enjoy writing short stories too. It's a different process. It's certainly much quicker for me anyway. I can often finish one in 2 or 3 sittings, where a novel will take several months to write. So there's kind of immediate gratification, and I'm all about immediate gratification, and never been one much for delaying gratification, but I managed to do it in the books.
So you partially answered this, but Jacob wants to know, what extent has true crime been an inspiration to you, to your writing? How much do you draw from real headlines?
Well, I think I hate to feel like I'm plugging myself, but my latest book is The Man from Milwaukee. And if you can see the name on the title there's
Dahmer.
Yeah, The Man from Milwaukee is Jeffrey Dahmer. And the book is really not a retelling of Jeffrey Dahmer's crimes, but it's about a young man who's very closeted, very unaccepting of himself as a gay man. And it takes place in 1991, in the summer of 91, when Jeffrey Dahmer was arrested. And the young man in Man from Milwaukee, Emery Hugh, developed a fascination with Dahmer and an obsession with him, and begins writing to him in prison. And he starts getting letters back, and it takes him down this rabbit hole of we don't know if he's going crazy or not. We don't know if he's actually following in Dahmer's footsteps as far as homicide or kidnapping, or I don't want to tell too much about the story, but it's definitely Jeffrey Dahmer was the inspiration for that. And as I mentioned earlier in Third Eye, Myra Henley and Ian Brady, Moore's Murders, were inspiration for that book. Penance, my second novel about the street kids, was inspired by, and I don't even remember the name of the movie. I want to say Streetwise, but and I think it was about street kids in Seattle, and I think that's what one of the inspirations for that. But one inspiration I know for sure for Penance was there was a boy who was murdered by a serial killer in Chicago who wasn't as famous as Casey, but he killed probably maybe as many people. His name was Larry Eiler, and one of the boys that he killed was a 14-year-old named Danny Bridges, and it's what led to him getting caught, because he put his remains in a dumpster behind his apartment building, and that's what led to him being caught. And I think that boy was sort of my inspiration for my main character in Penance, Jimmy Fells.
Martin follows up with, do you still write much short fiction? Any chance of film versions of anything you've written?
I do. Okay, I don't write as much short fiction as I used to, because I'm pretty much busy with novels, but on occasion I do. I wrote a vampire story last year set in Palm Springs, but which is supposed to come out sometime in 2021. And but no, I'm probably more focused on novels now. And as far as the film, that's kind of, I didn't lead into that, but I have had the screenplay for Man from Milwaukee was just finished. I have, and there's some producers that are interested in making a film version of it, and they wrote the screenplay. And it was kind of a kick to just read how someone changed my story into a screenplay. And they did a great job. I had there was one, a few years ago, Daniel Ferrans, who is a fairly well-known horror director, producer.
It's about I Am?
Yes, he optioned I Am. but nothing ever came of it. So I have tempered enthusiasm about Man from Milwaukee. The people behind it seem really interested and really motivated, and they do have the connections. So yeah, fingers crossed that, it's one of my one of my big dreams is to see my name on the screen as, from the novel by Rick R. Reed. So.
And Griffin wants to know, were the films of Alfred Hitchcock a big influence on Rick's work? I'm specifically thinking of Frenzy and, of course, Psycho.
It's interesting because I just finished an interview with the magazine, and in a sort of subtle way, the interviewer compared the character in Man from Milwaukee, Emery Hughes, to Norman Bates, because he's kind of an unassuming, kind of on the surface seems kind of sweet, and a boy who's very dedicated to his mother, who in my book is his mother is dying from AIDS, which is also part of the reason for his self-loathing as a gay man, because in '91 it was a death sentence, and he's taking care of his mother. But I don't think it was obvious. It was an obvious. Hitchcock is not an obvious inspiration, but all that stuff is buried up here, and so it probably comes out without my even realizing it.
All the good stuff gets stored up, right? And all the bad just gets siphoned right through.
Yeah.
So our good friend of the show, Jay the Stingray, says that your work sounds very interesting. He's going to have to check it out, and that's why we're here, sir.
Thank you, Jay.
So it seems as if you've made a play with Man from Milwaukee to come back to the horror genre, maybe not full-time, but at least more full-time.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see yourself as pursuing this more? Because I got to tell you, you're one of those guys that is sitting here on the show because of the chat, not because of me. I've been very selfish with a lot of guests, but in this case, it was people calling for you.
Really?
And yeah, absolutely. Then I went to a few websites, which unfortunately gave me bad contact information, but before I found the right contact information. But this came from my viewership that wanted to hear from you.
Well, I'm honored and flattered. That's nice to hear, that I'm not just writing into a void. So
can we expect more new work after Man from Milwaukee?
Yes.
In the genre?
Yes, actually, the books that are coming out next year, I have 3 that are contracted, and one is, I would call it literary fiction. It's not horror. It's about a small town gay bar, and it takes place on one Saturday night, and it explores the lives of the people that are patrons of the bar and how they intertwine, and it's a pivotal night. But then the other 2 are, one is a ghost story and the other is a vampire story. So yeah, I'm definitely getting more into that. And
well, that's
my comfort and my passion.
That sounds like we got Rick R. Reed back. That's what that sounds like to me. Not that you ever went completely away, but believe me, in the early days of the 1990s, you were one of those voices that stirred a lot of people out of their sugar coma of the 80s into a more challenging form of horror fiction. So seeing you back full front and center is definitely something that we're all eager to see happen.
Oh, good.
So Rick, how can people stay abreast of everything you have going on? How can they read what you're tweeting, and how can they just stay involved?
Well, let me see. First of all, I used to have a website that was rickrreed.com, but it was, honestly, I didn't think it was worth it. So now my website is my blog, which is, let me get the URL. It is rickrreedreality.blogspot.com. But I'm on Twitter, and I'm Rick R. Reed on Twitter. So twitter.com/Rick R. Reed. On Facebook, I'm facebook.com/Rick R. Reed. Obviously, I got in kind of early on some of these platforms because I don't have numbers after my name or anything. So
like this show's title, yeah, absolutely.
So I'm pretty easy to find on social media, and I do quite a bit on social media. I try to keep it about me and my life as much as it is about my writing. So I don't want to like appear as a big point of purchase display. My writing is part of my life. It informs it. I want to talk about that, but I also want people to know who I am.
So I want to pull the curtain back a little bit. And normally in my talk, I kind of have this pre-recorded talk that I give to people before the show goes on the air. One of my things is I usually talk about the show not being an infomercial, and I actually didn't do that tonight, but I didn't have to because Rick just said as much. So that's amazing. Yeah, it's about people. I think that the horror genre ultimately is these mortality and morality stories are all about people.
Mm-hmm.
It's about the people who tell the stories, the people who read the stories and watch the stories. But it's about us all trying to figure out those two subjects, morality and mortality, because no one's bottled the answer.
Right. And mortality is probably the bedrock of all horror. It's all about death and how we cope with that and what waits for us afterwards, if anything.
Rick, I want to thank you for coming on today. An hour flies by on this show. I don't know if you noticed.
It does, and I'm surprised because I will tell you I'm a total introvert, and I was very nervous about doing this, and I'm really surprised to see we've talked for an hour. And I'm surprised I could string together more than 2 sentences.
No, you did great. And you made a lot of people really happy to see and hear from you tonight. Will you come back when you have either the Ghost or the Vampire novel ready to go?
I would love to. For sure.
Awesome. In the meantime, guys, my channel will have some pre-recorded videos up in the coming couple weeks, but you won't probably see me live again before the holiday. So I want to wish everyone safe and happy Halloween. Do what you can, but take care of yourself and those around you. And in the meantime, before we get back together, everyone just be good.
Happy Halloween.
Oh.
This shit is...
Where you are to go, or ask an older person to help you.
U-turn to extra strength science.
In Florida, you duck and cover tight against the wall this way.
Stop wondering.
Hey, come on, you guys. Let's clean up for lunch.
There they are, 2 dirty boys.